I said it before and I'll say it again. Dwight Schrute is the main character of The Office. He's the character who goes through the most growth throughout the series. He goes from someone who's threatened to fire basically everyone in the office if he were ever promoted to manager, to having most of the office being in his wedding party. He grows not just as a businessman, but as a person. So today we're going to take Dwight Schrute and take a look at his own personal hero's journey. And I guess consider this your spoiler warning for the entirety of The Office, but surely you're expecting that if you're here to watch this. But first, let's talk about what exactly the hero's journey is. The phrase itself can be traced to the 1949 book The Hero with a Thousand Faces, written by Joseph Campbell. But the usage of the hero's journey can actually be seen throughout the most iconic pieces of literature throughout history. It's essentially a step-by-step writing technique that allows for a cohesive and interesting story to be told. The most iconic modern piece that adheres to the hero's journey being Star Wars, with George Lucas being on record stating that A New Hope was actually written around the hero's journey, and the movie being well documented as adhering to it step for step. But for this video, we'll be focusing more on Christopher Vogler's take on the hero's journey from his 2007 book, The Writer's Journey: Mythic Structure for Writers. While hitting all of the same notes, it has several less steps than the traditional hero's journey, with Vogler's having 12 steps instead of the 17 of Campbell's. These steps would be Ordinary World, Call to Adventure, Refusal of the Call, Meeting with the Mentor, Crossing the First Threshold, Tests, Allies and Enemies, Approach to the Innermost Cave, The Ordeal, Reward, The Road Back, The Resurrection, and The Return with the Elixir. These steps can also be organized into 3 separate acts. So let's go through the series and see how Dwight matches up. The beginning of the series would be Dwight's Ordinary World. Dwight at this point is a simple paper salesman / beet farmer. He isn't close with anyone in the office, and while he likely has greater ambitions of becoming manager of the Scranton branch or even leading all of Dunder Mifflin, it doesn't define his character quite yet. This would change in Season 3's episode The Coup. The episode actually pushes Dwight forward a few steps. Firstly, the Call to Adventure. In this episode, Angela convinces Dwight to talk to Jan and convince her to give him Michael's manager position and the Scranton branch. This is the first time we see Dwight seriously considering a manager position, though he does initially have some qualms about going behind Michael's back and betraying him. Even though it lasts for just a moment, this would be Dwight's refusal of the call. Though Angela is able to convince Dwight to go along with her plan, which ultimately backfires in a pretty spectacular fashion. This is where the next step comes into play. The meeting with the mentor. Dwight had already looked up to Michael from basically the beginning of the series. But during Michael's plan to trick Dwight into thinking that Jan had made him manager, we see how little Dwight actually does think of Michael. Not just with Dwight going behind Michael's back, but by insulting his vehicle and kind of belittling Michael after he believes he has been made the manager. When Michael turns the table on Dwight, and Dwight is literally on his knees begging to keep his job, Dwight would gain a new level of respect and admiration for Michael, as well as learning a new trait that a manager must have: mercy. Finally, this will also act as the end of the first act of Dwight's journey, which is the crossing of the threshold. This is Dwight leaving behind everything he was comfortable with, and leads to a period of exceptional growth for Dwight as a person. From this point on, most of the series is actually the Tests, Allies, and Enemies step. This is essentially Dwight making friends with almost everyone throughout the office. Let's go through and pick a couple points here and there to talk about, starting with some of Dwight's relationships that it really builds up through this phase. One of the first times we see Dwight going out of his way to be friendly with his coworkers, aside from Angela who he's secretly dating, is in another Season 3 episode, Back from Vacation. While Dwight has a much more minor role in this episode than some of the others, with the episode mainly revolving around a photograph of Michael and a person who may or may not be, but definitely is, Jan, being accidentally sent around to the entirety of Dunder Mifflin, and a small subplot revolving around Pam convincing Jim not to be upset about Karen moving in near Jim. Despite Pam taking the high road and trying to be supportive of Jim and Karen's relationship, she eventually does break down, and Dwight comes across Pam crying in the stairwell. Dwight actually comforts Pam, which actually seems pretty out of character for him, before kind of Dwighting the whole thing up. We've seen Dwight caring little about the rest of his coworkers thus far in the series, but this is a slight turning point for Dwight, and he does actually consider Pam to be his best friend by the end of the series. Sorry, Mose, you've been replaced. Next, let's move on to the most iconic relationship in the series, Dwight and Jim. It's not hard to see where they stand early in the series. Dwight pretty consistently through the bulk of the show's run is trying to get Jim fired, and Jim through the bulk of the series spent a bunch of his time just pranking Dwight and generally messing with him. So how do these two go from a general hatred of each other to Jim serving as Dwight's bestest mensch? At least until he gives up the position to Michael as a surprise. Well, it's a lot of little things. But my favorite scene showing their budding friendship would be in season 4, when Dwight, still in pain over the loss of Angela and the relationship of Angela and Andy, breaks down in the stairwell very similar to season 2 with Pam. But this time, Jim comes to Dwight's rescue. He sits with Dwight in the stairway and talks to Dwight about his relationship with Pam, and how hard it was for him when she was with Roy. Jim eventually leaves Dwight, and Dwight actually reaches out to Jim, not realizing that he's left. This is a huge step for Dwight, admitting that Jim was able to help him in a situation. But he doesn't realize that Jim is no longer there. This is a pretty big moment for these two, and though it wouldn't be their biggest moment in the series, it is one of their biggest moments in the arc. Dwight has a bunch of moments like this with a lot of members of The Office through the next several seasons until finally... The approach. The next step is when Dwight, Jim, and several other members of the Scranton branch are sent to Florida to help set up a Savers store. Dwight sees this as a big opportunity to prove his worth, especially with this being just a few episodes after specifically being told by Robert California that he is not manager material. So Dwight and the ragtag group of workers that he's put together over the course of a few episodes do their best to try to put together a cohesive and profitable store. But Jim finds out that Robert California is planning on sandbagging the project and firing whomever is in charge, which again happens to be Dwight. This leads us to the next step, the ordeal. This is when Jim steps in to save Dwight from being fired at the very last second. This is Dwight essentially facing the death of his career, and coming out from it by the skin of his teeth. And together, he and Jim return to Scranton, and Dwight nears the final few steps of his journey. In the final season, Dwight finally reaches his dream and is named manager after Andy resigns in order to follow his dreams of being a performer, despite everyone telling him that that's a terrible idea. This would be the reward step, which ends the second act and brings us to the final part of the video. The road back is the first step in the final act of the hero's journey. Dwight has reached his main goal, but there are still some loose ends, or really just one: Angela. Jim says it best when he states that he thinks Dwight has always loved Angela. His journey began because of her, and it's fitting that it ends with her as well. Dwight eventually chases down Angela in her car and proposes to her, despite believing at this point that Philip is not actually his son.
This expresses how loudly I love you!
The proposal pushes us a step further into the resurrection step. This is when Dwight realizes that he doesn't care if Philip is his son or not, but that he loves Angela anyways, and wants to be with her. She agrees and actually reveals to Dwight that Philip is actually his son, bringing the majority of Dwight's journey and Dwight's story to an end. There is one final step, but this really happens off screen between the second to last episode and the finale. We see that Dwight has made sweeping changes to Dunder Mifflin, and that everyone honestly seems incredibly happy with every change that Dwight has made. He's learned the value in friendship with his co-workers and how to become a competent manager, and he truly has completed his arc, beautifully and fully. But anyways, this has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. Thanks for the great feedback on the previous video I did in the series. I have a couple more planned to write and produce in the future. Subscribe down below to stay up to date on when we're releasing those. And while you're down there, comment what you'd like to hear me talk about next. Support us on our Patreon if you like the show and want to see more like it, and follow me on Twitter at 10K Bill to tweet any ideas you might have.